Hi guys, so in this video we are going to be implementing the GitHub Auth flow. For that I've already created a Supabase project and you can do so similarly by going to supabase.com. Once you've created your project, head over to the authentication in the sidebar, and in here you are going to see all your users, but currently we don't have any users in our database. So we are going to go to providers and we are going to look for GitHub. So we have many providers. Supabase gives us many providers, but we are interested in GitHub. And to enable GitHub, we need to access the client ID and client secret. Both of these are provided to us by GitHub. And to access these, we need to create a new auth app in our GitHub settings. So let's head over to that. Okay, so this is our repository. You need to go to your GitHub settings. In settings, go to your developer settings. In developer settings, go to auth apps, and these are all your auth apps under your account. I've already got chat-PDF local and chat-PDF prod, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to create a brand new auth app. So let's do that. The application name can be anything. I'm going to name it chat-PDF-IT. The homepage URL is the root page of your application. Since we are on localhost at the moment, we can just do this. Localhost at 5173. Application description is optional. So for the authorization callback URL, we can go to Supabase and we have that over here, callback URL. We're going to copy that and we're going to add it over here. What this does is that once GitHub authorizes the user, it's going to redirect the request to this URL. And over here, Supabase is going to generate a code and it's going to send it to our application. But we're going to deal with this later and it's going to make sense then. So we are going to register application. Paste it in here. Let's generate a client ID. So now the client secret is created. I can copy it and we can add it to the client secret in Supabase. Hit save and now the provider is enabled. Before we add Supabase to our project, let's try to make the UI for GitHub Authentication. Okay, so under our routes folder, we are going to create two folders and they are going to be wrapped around parentheses. First, I'm going to call auth and a second sibling folder would be named authed. So the difference between these is that auth would contain all the pages that an authenticated user would be able to access, and auth are any public pages that the user can access without being authenticated. So in our case, this is mostly the login page. So currently in this video, we're going to be working exclusively with the auth folder. And the reason we wrap this around with parentheses is that we want to be able to apply different layouts to both of these folders, and these are separate paths in our application, so we don't want to nest a layout further on. So by that, what I mean is that any layouts defined in auth will not be shared with the layout in auth, so there's no nesting involved. Secondly, the reason for wrapping it around in parentheses is that it doesn't affect the URL of the page. So if we didn't wrap it around in parentheses, defining an auth folder would actually add auth to the URL of the application, which we don't really want to add. So now that we have deleted the page in the root of routes, we need to create a page under auth. So let's do that. I'm going to render a div auth page, and now the root of the application is under the auth directory. Now let's try to center this content to the page. For that, we need to go to app.html, add a class to the body such that it takes the whole height and the whole width. And now in the auth folder, we need to define a layout. So layouts apply to all the pages nested under the auth folder. So if we have another folder and another page, it will also apply the layout to that page. Slot renders any page within the layout. So in our case, it is actually the auth page. Flex call item center, justify center each screen, and yeah, we have the page centered right now. Now to build something like this, we need to use Shadcn UI. First, we need to add the card component from Shadcn, and we already have the button component. So now we have the card component, and we can render this card component. So let's fix the import everything as card from $lib cards. The title would be to welcome to chat PDF. Yep. The card description would be to please sign in with GitHub. Then we need to have the content, card.content. And within the content, we just need to have a button, sign in with GitHub. The variant can be outline, and we can, let's add the GitHub icon to the button. For that, I'm going to create an icons folder under components, and I'm going to add github.svelte. I'm going to copy paste some code for the GitHub icon, and then I can render this inside the button. Let's give this a size of 4 and just give it a margin of 2. Now to increase the width of this card a little bit, we are going to add some classes to the root. And for all the content within to take full width, we're going to do this grid gap of 4. Let's also increase the size of the title a little bit. Okay, now we have the UI ready. Now it makes sense for us to initialize Supabase into our project and set up the OAuth flow. Basically what I mean is that we need to add live to this button so that once the user clicks, we can authenticate the user into our application. To initialize Supabase into our SvelteKit project, Supabase has created a very good blog post on how to do so. So we're going to follow that. Most of this code would be copy paste, but we'll make a walkthrough so as to understand what's happening. The first step is to install the necessary packages. And then we need an env file to store the secrets for Supabase. The first secret we are going to store is Supabase URL, and the second one is public Supabase anonymous key. So the project URL is this, and the anonymous key is this. Thirdly, we need to set up a server-side hook. A server-side hook is something that would inject the Supabase client, a function to get the session, and also has an auth guard in place. And what this does is that if the user is not authenticated, it would take us to the login page, but if they're authenticated and trying to access the local page, they would just be redirected to the authenticated side of our application. So let's just copy this. We need to define a hooks.server.ts. The server.ts implies that this whole file is meant for server context only. We are going to see many, we're going to see many TypeScript edits, but for this we need to do module augmentation in TypeScript, which means to copy this file contents and paste it in app.d.ts. What this helps with is that now SvelteKit knows that there's a hook that returns a locals object which contains all of these entities, which is the Supabase client, a method to get the session, the current session, and the current user. We need to make a slight adjustment to the handle that we just copied from Supabase, and we need to change a specific thing about this handle, and that is specifically the path name for private users, that is authenticated users, and for public routes such as authentication route. Our private routes are the ones that start with chat, and if the user has no session and the user is trying to go to any route that starts with chat, we just want to redirect them to the auth page, which is the root page. And if the user is authenticated and they are trying to access the auth page, then we just redirect them to chat. Apart from this, we don't need to change anything with this file. So let's continue with the further instructions. Now we need to create the Supabase client in the root layout of our project. So the root layout is basically, you can think of it as the entry point of our application. And we need to do this in two files. One is the layout.ts and the layout.server.ts. The layout.server.ts runs on the server, and any data returned from this layout is then injected into the layout, which runs both on the server and the client. We already have the layout.svelte, but that is used to just import the global CSS file into our application. We need to define two more files. One is the layout.server.ts. Then we can just copy the code from the documentation into here, and we don't need to change anything. The other one is layout.ts. So this data corresponds to the data that was returned from the server layout. So as you can see, we are returning the session and the cookies, and we are accessing that data within this layout. And then we are creating Supabase client, depending whether we are in the browser context or we are in the server context. We are getting the current session, we are getting the current user, and we are returning all these three objects. Now these three objects returned are accessible in any part of our application because they are loaded within the root layout of our application. So to verify that all of these objects are available throughout our application, we can go to the page that we just created, and in Svelte, when you define export let data, it actually accesses all the data that can be accessed from this page. So you can see we are already able to access Supabase, session, and user. So now let's add sign in with authentication to this button. And for that, what we can do is we can access the Supabase instance from the root layout that we just defined. So Supabase is equal to data.supabase. So we're going to define a function, sign in with GitHub. It's going to do supabase.auth.sign in with auth. The provider is GitHub, and we're going to provide a redirect URL to location.origin, which is basically the root page from where we are invoking this function, plus /auth/callback. Now we need to define this route to be able to get the code that Supabase creates to basically create a session in our application. So once GitHub authorizes the application, it sends a request to the Supabase authorization URL callback, from where we are going to get code back to this URL. So we need to be able to catch that code and then create a session using that code by exchanging the code for a session. It's all going to make sense once we define that route, so please bear with me. So this returns us with data. Let's await this first. An error. So if there's an error or the data is undefined, we want to redirect the user to the auth page, which is the root page. Else we want to redirect the user to the data.url, which is the actual auth consent screen. We can add a click handler to this button, and then once I click on sign in with GitHub, we are now presented with the authorization consent screen for GitHub. And once we authorize, then we are going to be directed back to the Supabase URL that we added as a authorization callback URL. I'm going to click on authorize, but this is going to redirect it to the auth callback that we just defined over here, but we are not able to catch it because we do not have this route defined. So let's define this route. So under the auth group, we are going to create auth/callback and a server.ts file. The reason this is not a page is because we don't really necessarily need to render a page for this. We just need to get the hold of the code in the URL. So we can do that in a basic GET request. So let's define a GET route. Let's get access to the URL, and from locals we need Supabase to exchange the code for a session. So let's try to get access of the code, which is URL. It exists on the search parameters for this route. .get code. If the code exists, we want to exchange it for a session. And if it doesn't exist, we can simply redirect to the authentication page. Once everything successfully happens, we can go to the authenticated chat page. Now we are going to create the chat page under the auth route group. For now, this is just going to be an H1 chat page, authenticated. So now if I sign in with GitHub, we go to the authenticated chat page, and the whole flow is that once we click on the sign in with GitHub, we are redirected to GitHub authorization consent page, which authorizes us and sends a request to the Supabase authorization callback URL. From Supabase authorization callback, we are being redirected to our application under the auth callback route, in which we are getting a code and we are exchanging that code for a session, which then gives us the session, and that session is persisted in cookies. And now even if we refresh, we're just authenticated. And due to that auth handle, if we are trying to go back to the authentication page, since we are signed in, we are always going to be redirected to the chat page. Right now we don't have a logout button, so to log out we can just clear the cookies. And now if I refresh from the authenticated page, we're going to go to the login page. I know this was a lot to consume in the first try, so I'll try to go through it again. What we first did was we created two route groups, an auth route group and an auth route group. The difference between them is that auth is for all public pages for unauthenticated users. Auth is for all authenticated user pages. Secondly, we had to inject the Supabase client, and for that what we did is that we created a handle. The Supabase handle injects the Supabase client into locals, and internally we also defined a save get session which we then call in our auth card to ensure that the user exists. And we also fetch the user, and then we return both the session and the user from the Supabase handle. And in the auth guard, we are just making sure that if the user is unauthenticated and they're trying to access any private routes, we redirect them to the login page. And if the user is authenticated and is trying to access the public routes, which is authentication page in our case, we redirect them to the chat interface, which is the authenticated page we have. If both of these cases are not met, meaning that the user is actually trying to access the page that they should be able to access, then we just resolve the event and let it handle without doing any sort of side effects like redirecting. Now we define a handle of a sequence which runs the Supabase handle first, and then it runs the auth guard. This is important because Supabase initializes the Supabase instance on the server side, which we then use to get the session. And once we get the session, we can run the auth guard, which prevents the user from accessing routes that they should not be able to access. Then we go ahead to the layout.server.ts, which runs on the server. It just gets the session and the cookies and returns them to the layout.ts file. In the layout.ts file, then we use these cookies and this session to basically, again, create a Supabase client, either in the browser context or in the server context. And we also fetch the user's session and the user's data and return all of this to be available throughout our application. Inside the auth page, we have the page in which we are signing the user using the GitHub provider, and we are redirecting the user to the auth/callback page. So in the auth/callback route, we are then grabbing the code that Supabase sends us after successful authorization from GitHub, and we are exchanging this code for the session. So this ensures that the user's session was created, and once it was created, we just move to the authenticated pages, which is the chat page over here. So that was pretty much it for this video. We implemented Supabase auth using GitHub, and I think that the next step is to define all the database schemas that we are going to be using in this project. I think now is a good time to make a git commit. So we're going to add all files, commit. So if you are excited for more, like and subscribe. See you on the next one.